So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ivey Gualandris. Ivey is the associate professor, operations management sustainability at the Ivey Business School, endowed Bell Hodgson Chair in Regenerative Agriculture, and Western Faculty Scholar. He's the academic director of the Center for Building Sustainable Value, which is a very, and also the Network for Business Sustainability. Perhaps you know that Ivey is a global reference in the sustainability area, and those two centers, those two groups and networks are very, very important. I know because I was there, I was teaching there, so and I had the pleasure to be part of the center and projects, etc. So fantastic group. And Ivey is a global authority on supply chains, sustainability, and regeneration. He's very well known, and he's very enthusiastic about the theme. He's pushing actually this, and he wants change. One thing that I learned from him is that he wants to change. We don't, of course, we're doing research, teaching, but we ultimately want to change. And Ivey is always organizing projects. There's this great project in Ontario. I had the pleasure to be part of this project to foster agricultural regeneration in Ontario, and there's I think we're going to mention some of those projects in one way or another. And also there is a very important initiative in the Journal of Supply Chain Management on regeneration. So Ivey is the lead invited editor. I'm also Alana and I and others were part of this project. It's we hope that this will also help move this agenda forward. Thank you so much, Ivey. Real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Sergio. Can I use this microphone or? Yeah, that is representation. I'll stay here and I'll try to work it from here. Good morning, everyone. Buongiorno. I have prepared a quite dense presentation for all of you. So if you go out and your brain doesn't hurt, it means that I failed in my attempt to deliver some thick knowledge. So I framed my presentation around thinking and the polycrisis. And I'm going to go straight into it. This is a statement that many of you, I'm sure, know and have used in their own learning. And it is something that actually came up during the first day in a completely non-coordinated fashion and process. The statement is, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. The key words here are problems and thinking, which are basically the core subject of my presentation. I'm going to break down my presentation in 3 parts, roughly 15 minutes each. And I want to go very deep. So I also hope that we will engage in a passionate Q&A both here and following the presentation. The first block of the presentation will focus on really exploring the anatomy of the problems that we are currently facing as humanity. Then I will reflect on how our thinking, our taken for granted assumptions and principles, overall across businesses, but more so in how we design and manage supply chains, actually exacerbate the polycrisis rather than trying to mitigate for it. And then third, if our current thinking is not appropriate in solving the problem, what alternative thinking should we consider? What alternative principles, decision-making principles and organizing principles can we consider that can help us to address the polycrisis? So let's go straight into it. I think the first block will repeat some notions that you are already highly familiar with. Nonetheless, I think at a time where there is rampant skepticism and denialism, it is important to start from the basics. So let's go into the problems. The polycrisis, I'm going to describe 3 aspects of the polycrisis: climate, biodiversity, and social inequity. And I will explain for each one of them what they are, what causes them, and what are the consequences. So for climate, here are 2 recent papers that basically summarize the discourse on climate change and global warming. The paper on the left basically present some evidence, compelling evidence that global warming basically is the steady, consistent increase in temperatures during the last 200 years. And this temperature increases characterize both the minimum, the maximum, and the average global temperatures. That's why global warming. It is unprecedented in about 400 million years. So there has been only a couple of times where we have seen such a rapid acceleration in temperature, and all those cases were mainly driven by volcano eruptions and meteorites. And this paper also breaks down the time series in the recent 200 years and basically concludes suggesting that we should expect acceleration in global temperature increases. The paper on the right is a very recent paper that uses a new technique, statistical technique, to break down the time series of global temperatures and correlate them with greenhouse gas emissions, and basically provides compelling evidence that the relationship is causal. In the past 200 years, increases in greenhouse gas emissions and increases in concentration, atmospheric concentration of CO2 are driving global changes in temperatures. The same wasn't true at paleoclimatic timescales, where instead exogenous events came in, such as volcanoes, eruptions, and meteorites, changed the equilibrium on Earth and caused greenhouse gas emissions. So in the past, the relationship was reversed, but is not true in the most recent 200 years. So conclusion, global change is happening, is likely going to accelerate, and is mainly driven by emissions. What are the consequences? I like that statement because it summarizes the main consequences and patterns of change that we are observing. It never rains, but it pours. You know, how many of you are in engineering and therefore have studied energy balance and mass balance? Energy and mass on Earth don't change. So the total amount of energy and mass remains the same. The total amount of water remains the same. Is how the pattern through which that energy, that mass, that water manifests on Earth that changes. So what we experience now with precipitation is that we have overall less precipitation, but very extreme events where there is heavy rainfall coming in with huge amount of water being poured in a small time window, which therefore creates issues in how we mitigate that problem. Similarly, for droughts, specifically agricultural and ecological droughts, we have more areas that are affected by droughts around the world, and the time windows for those droughts is expanding. The third one is cyclones and hurricanes. We actually have a total cumulative energy of cyclones that has been slightly reducing during the past 50 years due to natural variability, but the way that energy accumulates and dissipates on the global Earth is changing. Basically, we have more frequent, intense cyclones than we used to have in the past. It means that these cyclones have higher speeds of wind in their maximum manifestation, but also they intensify more quickly. If in the past it took anywhere between 2 or 3 days for a cyclone to gain strength and create destruction, now it happens on average in 24 hours. So long story short, global warming is happening, is driven by human activity and related emissions, and is causing changes in the patterns of rainfall, droughts, cyclones that put pressure on our ecosystems. Now, biodiversity. This is a graph that I often use to summarize it. WWF, together with other researchers around the world, has tracked the population size over the past 50 years of more than 5,000 species, and found that on average, the population size of each species reduced by approximately 69%. That doesn't mean that we have 69% less number of species. It means that on average, the population of each species has been shrinking. This means that for some species now, they are at the brink of extinction, while just 50 years ago they were thriving. What are the consequences and causes of biodiversity? I'm putting this graph here because it's the result of a study that considered 45,000 empirical studies on biodiversity loss causes and consequences. I'm not asking you to actually understand the graph. I'm going to describe to you what are the main insights from this study. On terrestrial systems, basically land, climate change is actually a consequence of biodiversity loss for the most part. Basically, when we change land use applications and we intensify agricultural production, we destroy ecosystem. And when we destroy ecosystem, they release more carbon than they used to, therefore exacerbating climate change. The same pattern is true for freshwater systems, meaning inland lakes, but it is not true for oceans. For oceans, it's actually the opposite. Climate change put pressure on aerobic metabolisms in the oceans that collapse, therefore reducing biodiversity and resilience. So if on land climate change is a consequence of biodiversity loss, in the ocean is a cause of biodiversity loss. And then third dimension of the polycrisis, social equity. I like very much this definition that comes from sociology, is ensuring fairness and justice for all members of society with a focus of providing targeted support to marginalized, and I think the key word is systematically disadvantaged groups. Now, how is climate and or biodiversity loss contributing to this systematic disadvantages? I'm going to break it down by starting from management research. This statement, fairly recent, basically demonstrates that management research has already pointed out that social inequity is not happening by chance. It's actually a systematic process that is elite-driven. Some earner maximizers, so profiters around the world, through their consumption, cause climate change and biodiversity loss that have disproportionate consequences for lower social classes. Let me break it down for you, providing some additional evidence and then connecting the dots to summarize the anatomy of the polycrisis. First observation, high-income individuals contribute the most to climate and biodiversity loss. The study on the left shows that the top 1% of earners on Earth emits more carbon than the sum of the carbon that is emitted by the bottom 50%. So the top one emits almost twice as much the bottom 50%. Not just that, the trend in consumption levels and emissions has been steeper for the global top 1% than it has been for the global bottom 50%. Same pattern can be observed in another study that focuses on biodiversity loss. L, N, and P are the basic elements of life, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. And so basically shows that the consumption patterns of the top 1%, which are characterized by the blue bars, are responsible anywhere between 31 to 67% of biodiversity loss on Earth. Whereas the poorest 1% is responsible for maximum 5% of the biodiversity loss. So key point here, we can go as much in depth as you like, but key point is that both biodiversity loss and climate change that has very important consequences for our ecosystem are driven by the top 1% of the population. I think basically it's driven by us in the room. Not just high-income individuals impact the most the crisis, they also exhibit lower pro-social behavior. This is counterintuitive. You would expect that as we get richer, we have more resources, and therefore we give more. But instead, several studies have shown that in both absolute and relative terms, the richer you get, the less you give to others through pro-social behavior and donations and expressions of altruism. And this difference is even stronger in states or contexts where there is very high income inequality. So where the distance between the lower social class and the upper social class is sharper. And it makes sense, actually, if you think about social dynamics. The richer you get, the more independent and autonomous you become. The less importance you give to relationships because you don't depend on them to survive. Whereas instead, if you are poor, you rely on social network to seek support and sustain yourself throughout life. When you're richer, you don't give importance to those relationships anymore. Therefore, you don't invest into pro-social behavior of different forms. So not just they, or we, I should say, high-income individuals impact the most climate and biodiversity. They also invest the least on addressing the consequences. And final one, which is also very important, is that high-income individuals are least impacted by climate and biodiversity loss. So they don't pay the consequences of their behavior. This is just one of many climate attribution science articles that I studied in the past couple of years, is that in the context of Texas and during Hurricane Harvey, there has been major flooding. But guess what? The only neighborhoods that flooded were those that were Latino and low-income neighborhoods. This is because physical infrastructure throughout the space, throughout the city, developed farther in high-income neighborhoods that have protection and drainage systems that absorbed the manifestation of flooding, whereas in poor neighborhoods that didn't happen. And this is just one example illustration of disproportionality in consequences. So I want to reconnect the dots with you and present what I believe is a fairly clear description of the anatomy of the polycrisis that we are experiencing. We have the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that are mutually reinforcing. As you reduce biodiversity, you increase emissions. As you increase climate change, you increase pressure on biodiversity, therefore reducing it over time. These two crises are mainly driven by consumption level and patterns, more so driven by the top 1% of the population by income. The main mechanism for climate is that consumption releases emissions, and consumption requires land use change, direct exploitation, pollution, and introduction of invasive species that drive biodiversity loss. However, why is this crisis perpetuating? Is because there is no feedback loop. Those that consume the most don't experience the consequences of their behavior because they are shielded by the social systems that we have put in place. So while you contribute to the crisis, you don't experience the crisis, therefore you don't correct your behavior. This is very well known in construal theory. The more geographical, temporal, or social separation there is between causes and consequences of a behavior, the least motivated you feel in correcting such behavior. So this is the problem we need to solve for. Now I want to transition in the second block of the presentation that describes how this problem is not happening randomly, is actually generated by our thinking, a thinking that we need to change if we want to be able to address this crisis. Just before to go into that, I wanted to clarify that very often we believe that economic growth can solve the problem. And I want to show a couple of data points that actually suggest the opposite. This is a study that looked at how GDP globally increased over the past 70 years and shows a steep, consistent increase over time, the green line. However, if you start adjusting GDP for other indexes that consider life expectancy, life satisfaction, and biodiversity indexes, then you realize that past 1975, the world has not been progressing, meaning that we have not created net new value, we have just redistributed value away from ecosystem and communities into GDP, but we have not really created new value. We haven't improved our productivity in the sense of creating value, economically valuable opportunities. Another way to see this is a very recent couple of studies This is a report that just came out in the US last year that shows that while in the US in the past 30 years they outperformed in GDP growth, GDP in the US grew more than 8 times faster than in Europe. All the other societal indexes actually deteriorated. Social life expectancy has been decreasing in the US. Prevalence of depression has been increasing in the US. Murder rate has been increasing in the US. Income inequality has been exacerbating in the US. Social isolation has been growing. So while we have increased our economic growth, we have actually caused major trouble for society. Not just the US, but even in Europe. And this case in point is the Dutch agricultural system, which is prized to be one of the most productive systems in the world, is actually the second most productive agricultural system in the world, and contributes about $13 billion to GDP every year. However, they just finished to do an analysis on the valorization of the consequences of approaching the agricultural system in a certain way. And they figured out that in order to correct for the consequences of the current agricultural system functioning, in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, and social implications, you would need to spend $18 billion a year. So guess what? The agricultural system that we prize actually has a net negative impact on our genuine progress as a society. It costs us $5 billion a year. Those $5 billion, though, we don't see, we don't measure in our pockets, therefore we don't address. Now, let's go into the thinking that caused these effects. And I hope that you will see that some of this thinking is actually very much aligned on the notions that you received in the classroom here at Insper when someone teaches you operations management. In fact, I was teaching those same subjects and principles just a few years ago in my undergraduate, graduate, and master programs in operations management, which I now consider to be fundamentally flawed suggestions. Before to start with unpacking the thinking that sort of generates this polycrisis, let me define it. I'm going to talk about mental models and use synonyms like synonyma-like beliefs, paradigmatic assumptions, and organizing principles. What I'm referring to when I say thinking, I'm basically referring to habits of thought or deeply held assumptions and taken for granted ways of operating that influence how we think, what we do, and how we talk, without even us being fully conscious about it. Well, it is very important to focus on thinking because system science have shown that when we embrace certain mental models, then we build relationship according to those mental models, and we build power dynamics, practices, and policies that reflect those mental models, mainly cementing those mental models into how our society works. So by focusing on the thinking, we can then address bottom-up the organization in our society. Here are 3 core principles of supply chain management. As Juana recommended me to say in our article, these are principles that were once very useful to anchor supply chain management for what we call economic growth, but are currently highly problematic. And I'm going to explain how they are currently problematic. The first one is that most ops professors go in the classroom to basically explain that if we do a good job with our operations and supply chains, we design them in such a way that they seek efficiency through specialization and scale economies. So that's how supply chains are designed. Second, they are not just designed for efficiency through specialization and scale economies, they are also designed for being highly responsive to changes in the final demand. If demand goes up, you want to offer more products. If demand goes down, you want to offer lower products. But you want to remain cost efficient in the way you address these demand changes. And then the third principle is that you want to have control of your supply chain. If you are a large buying company, you want to have control on your suppliers and your distributors, and that control is achieved through top-down governance structures, where you impose coercively, when possible, incentive structures on them. I'm going to break down each one of them and show to you where they come from and why they are problematic. First one, It comes from the concept of absolute advantage by Adam Smith. The concept of absolute advantage, and in the simple mathematical modeling of basic economics that many of you have studied, basically suggests that the possibility of free trade in presence of absolute advantage, meaning that one company or country has a higher labor productivity on a specific set of products than another country or company, it forces or induces those companies to specialize on the product that they are best at producing, and then they trade. And by specializing and trading, they achieve a higher efficiency, meaning higher output per input, per steady input of resources. FYI, nowhere in their model, they described what is the maximum level of output that each country should achieve to avoid breaking planetary boundaries and community dynamics. So there was no upper level threshold that was justified based on social ecological considerations in their model. The concept of absolute advantage was then turned in a concept of comparative advantage by Ricardo 50 years after Adam Smith. The main notion here is that even when a country or a company is lower performing than another country and company on multiple items, on multiple products, there is still benefit in specialization and trading, because by leveraging comparative advantage within a country, you are still optimizing allocation of resources and therefore productivity at the system level. Now, these ideas were very compelling and very pervasive. In fact, this is a palm oil plantation in Indonesia. There is soil and climate that support palm oil growth in that part of the world, and palm oil as a plant is the most efficient at producing natural oils than any other plant in the world. So from an efficiency perspective, it is actually perfect for Indonesia to focus on palm oil plantation. In Canada, 57% of our arable land is cultivated at either wheat or canola. 57% of Canada's land. It's huge. In California, that's not a fake picture of an AI picture, that's a real picture. Do you know that if you are eating almonds, the probability that those almonds come from California is 80%, because California produces 80% of all the almonds in the world. We follow the math. Specialization, trade, maximize economic efficiency worldwide. Except that huge social and ecological consequences of palm oil plantations in Indonesia, drop of 42% of our biodiversity in only 50 years in Canada, and in the United States, epidemic for the pollinators. Because let me ask you a question. What is the bottleneck when you want to grow almonds in one state? Is it water? Is it soil? What is it that constrains your productivity? It is pollinators. You have a 6 weeks window to ship pollinators, beehives from all over the states into California to pollinate those trees and turn flowers into fruits. If you don't ship beehives, you don't have 80% of all beehives in the United States in California, right? So new supply chains developed in the States to gather beehives from all over and ship them over those 6 weeks. Well, it turns out that bees don't like it. So here is an example of how focusing on specialization and scale economies to pursue efficiency without considering planetary limits and community dynamics is really doubling down on all the issues that we have seen. It increases GHG emissions. It changes how we use land in ways that is not appropriate, and it exacerbates inequity in the system. So by thinking according to those principles, we cannot solve the crisis. We just exacerbate it. Second principle, responsiveness to final demand. Let me give you an example again in agriculture. Before to do that, I want to explain the concept of responsiveness with a little bit of math. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but this actually is the slide that I used in my undergraduate program in Operations Management 101. So there is this concept of throughput in operation management, which is how many units of products you produce in a given amount of time, in 1 unit of time. Throughput is the reverse of cycle time, which is basically the amount of time that your operations take to produce 1 unit of output. In order to play with throughput, you have only 2 variables. Either you increase throughput by having more employees, or you keep the same number of employees, but you increase throughput by training them, by giving them better technology, AI, productivity increases, so that each employee takes less time to produce 1 unit of output. You can only play with those 2 and guess in what directions we're moving. Are we increasing the number of employees, or we're making them more productive? We are making them more productive. Okay, so we are trying to squeeze the processing time, so the amount of time that each employee requires to publish a paper. This is how we do it, not just with humans, but also with the meat that we buy. If we want to increase responsiveness to final demand and increase throughput in cattle operations, in beef operations, what we do is that we stock up a bunch of cows and we prevent them from moving. Why do we prevent them from moving? Because if you don't move, your fat and mass grows faster. So you reduce the amount of time that a cow requires to gain a certain weight. So you don't want them to move in order to increase processing time and therefore achieve more throughput. You don't just work on whether they move or not. You want to feed them the right stuff. To be healthy? Not necessarily. To grow fatter, to develop mass. So you adjust the recipes that you feed to your cows to that goal. You know, what happens when you don't move? Basically, you live in your poop. And if you live in your poop, is that healthy? Not really. So you develop diseases. So what do you do in order to prevent diseases? You use antibiotics. So that's why it's been very difficult for a long period of time to find meat that wasn't grown through antibiotics adoption. What are some of the unintended consequences of focusing on responsiveness and throughput in a beef production operation? So first of all, we use 40% of our land to feed cows because now we have so many in so small amount of space that we still need to grow a lot of crop in a lot of land to feed that intensified process of meat production. We have more cows in more limited space rather than having cows grazing naturally in the environment. So we use a lot of our land for crop production, which is destructive in itself. Second, we don't have manure naturally spread throughout the fields because the cows go around. We have it all in one place, which therefore causes cost when we try to redistribute manure for nutrient cycling in the field. And third, while we might prevent some diseases, not walking, not engaging with ecosystems and being fed certain items has been shown to cause a number of disorders that have also created health issues for humans, not just for animals. So this is an example of how to pursue responsiveness. You actually unintentionally end up with a system that has all sorts of unintended consequences for social ecological systems. It's not just animals. This is actually a welding firm in Italy. I was talking to a friend of mine that was offered a job as director in a welding facility, and he turned it down. And I said, why do you turn down a directorship position? And he said to me, I don't want to be liable. I said, what do you mean you want to be liable? You are in the north of Italy, high-tech company. Everything is done to spec. So you have health and safety protocols in place. No, but I tell you this, welding operators don't get paid too much. So if we have more demand coming in, they are happy to work longer hours. And also to avoid taking breaks during their shift. And so what's the problem? They get a higher salary. Well, yes, but when you are doing welding operations, you have pollutants released in the air. And even if you have proper systems installed to clean the air, they are not as efficient of cleaning the air constantly. You need to stop your operations for a minimum amount of time for them to clean the air and for the air to be clean throughout your operations and your operation time. But when you are trying to respond to peaks of demand, both management and employees are completely happy to avoid those breaks. Without those breaks, your equipment doesn't clean the air appropriately, so they are exposed to abnormal levels of air pollution that most likely will cause unintended consequences down the road for their health. If you are a director and you sign off on those protocols, you are directly responsible for those health problems down the road. So this is another example of how to push on responsiveness throughput through cutting corners on your operational processes results in great responsiveness to the market, but also great trouble for your employees and animals in the previous example. So once again, if you push too hard on throughput, you don't solve the problems, you exacerbate the problems. Final one, top-down mechanisms in the supply chain. There has been one mechanism specifically that has been studied extensively, and we often refer to when it comes to controlling our global supply chains. And this mechanism is auditing. So we want to audit our suppliers so that we make sure that they respect certain standards. And these standards are defined globally: health and safety, ISO 14000, etc. Now, a huge body of research shows that auditing processes are completely ineffective in addressing social and ecological performance in the supply chain. First of all, after an audit, everything goes back to abnormal because suppliers are under great price and time pressure. You can audit them on good protocols, but like the welding facility that I just described, if they are under time or price pressure, they will deviate from standard protocols. It's very difficult to have a continuous auditing process that detect deviations from protocol. So highly ineffective. Not just that, audits imposed top-down remove agency from suppliers rather than empowering them. You're basically telling them how to address certain problems without understanding their context. So you ask them to take on more burden, administrative duties and protocols to address your request of responsibility with them having no agency on how they address the problems. That also exacerbate inequity, both within countries and across countries in global supply chains. So long story short, supply chains that are designed and managed to basically pursue those principles result in exacerbating the anatomy of the crisis that I already described. Now that should be kind of dissonant, cognitively dissonant for you. Like, we've been told to follow these principles. And we have been told that they were beneficial because if we have economic growth, we will address social and ecological problems. Well, quite the opposite. Social and ecological problems are in trade-off with economic growth most of the time, and we are producing economic growth in a zero-sum game where we have been having growth fictionally, meaning we have been stealing from certain parts of the world or within our country to achieve economic growth that is concentrated in certain social classes. Now, let me move into the final part of my presentation, which is, so what? What different principles can we use? Like, if we don't follow these three principles, what other principles can we embrace? And that's basically, spoiler alert, has already been published. So you can actually look at the details in the paper. But I'm going to break down three principles that antagonize with the three principles that I just presented. And I'm going to use real examples of how those principles were implemented to achieve social ecological regeneration while retaining economic viability. First one, I'm going to oppose the idea of efficiency through scale and specialization with a principle that we call proportionality. According to the proportionality principle, every business in a supply chain should adjust the scale and scope of production and consumption within the proportions that a local socio-ecological system can tolerate best. What does it mean in specific terms? Let me give you some examples. Here, I'm going to actually exploit a recent paper that Oana published in JMS, and that I think is a fantastic study. And well, they provided theoretical contribution. I'm going to use the sort of the more practical insights from that study. So the study was focused in Finland, so global north, some of us would say, privileged country. What happened in Finland is that they had huge problems with algae bloom in their inland lakes. The consequence of the algae bloom development, so the natural pollution in the lakes, was that small fish exploded relative to large fish. And that created economic consequences because highly specialized large-scale fishing operations went under because they didn't have the yields that they needed on large fish that they were used to harvest. But where does that problem come from? It was compounded by three main drivers. First, renewable energy creation, which in some cases has unintended consequences. When you build a dam on a river to capture kinetic energy to transform into electricity, you are actually blocking the natural flow and migration flows of fish. So that's one problem. So nutrients cycles have been altered by imposing dams. Second, nitrogen-rich fertilizers used on agricultural fields nearby lakes. If you are aggressively exploiting land and soil deteriorate, those nitrogen is not absorbed in the soil, it remains on the surface of the soil. And when you have heavy precipitation, that nitrogen is washed away, it goes into the local watershed, it goes into the lake, and with more nitrogen, algae explode. Third, pulp and paper industry causing deforestation in nearby areas. If you had very dense forests, through their roots, they would absorb some of the nitrogen. They would take up some of the nutrients, preventing the problem. But if you remove trees, then you don't have a natural counterbalance effect for those consequences. So anyhow, that was the situation. What happened is that local community of small fishers came together working with ecologists and started to sense that the proportions in the lake between large and small fish was off, and started to think about, can we adjust our operations to the ecosystem rather than trying to affect the ecosystem to adjust to mimic our operations. So they adjusted their operations and started to develop protocols and procedures to actually harvest small fish rather than large fish. What happened as they did so, they were removing small fish, which is basically removing nutrients from the lake. But what happens also from an ecological chain reaction is that small fish feed off zooplankton. Zooplankton is a microorganism that feed off algae. So if you remove small fish, zooplankton population explodes, they eat more algae, biodiversity is rebalanced in the inland lakes, causing water purification. With water purification, the food chain was also rebalanced, so they saw larger fish coming back, which therefore resulted in a more balanced, proportional harvesting practice in equilibrium with what the lakes could offer. Not just that, there was a reciprocity in the fact that with pure water in the lakes, now downstream communities could actually use that water, because at that point it was clean, for drinking purposes and sanitation purposes. So a triadic set of benefits out of an intervention that focused on adjusting the scale and scope of the fishing operations to basically align with what nature would require, rather than the opposite, shaping nature to improve our specialization and efficiency. This is not novel. Like I have several examples here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to focus on one on indigenous knowledge. Indigenous communities throughout Canada and North America, and most likely also South America, when they were fishing salmon, they were not fishing female salmon. They would release female salmon if it was caught unintentionally, because they wanted to retain regenerative capacity in the salmon community. Not just that, their hooks that they developed, that they engineered to catch salmon, were designed such that they would not hook up small salmon, but only large salmon. That's why small salmon is still young, under development. It contributes to the wealth and thriving of the local ecosystem community of salmon. You don't want to harvest them. You want to focus on the mature salmon only. So they were adjusting their fishing practices to retain the natural proportions that would work best for nature, rather than specializing on certain types of species. So if you start to think about the proportions that nature require and adjust your operations according to that proportion, rather than overly specialize in trade, then you can reverse the polycrisis. You avoid excessive change in land use, you avoid excessive intensification, and even you curb consumption, because if you know you're stretching too far into consumption patterns that are not sustainable according to regenerative patterns, then you become familiar with that and you actively shape your consumption accordingly. Second principle. So the second principle that was damaging and contributing to the polycrisis was the idea of responsiveness. If we are very responsive to final demand, we cause problem. So then the main idea here is about polyrhythmicity. So how to think about not the rhythms of demand, but the rhythms of supply. Our supply comes from communities and ecosystems. So what are the rhythms that naturally characterize communities and ecosystems? What rhythms should we pursue that protect or even strengthen the health of our supply, of our ecosystems and communities? And let's be familiar with those rhythms rather than thinking about demand and imposing those rhythms on our labor force and our ecosystems. Some examples. I'm going to start with a non-business example. This is a piece of text that I'm not going to require you to go through in the moment. I'm going to explain it. But I was walking with my two girls in a national park in Ontario, and I was struck by this example where they were presenting fire as actually a positive disturbance, not a negative disturbance that we need to fight. It's a positive disturbance if fire occurs in the right frequencies and with the right intensity. Fire has a number of benefits, such as suppressing aggressive plant species that would otherwise take over others. So fire, if it manifests in the right frequency and in the right intensity, it is actually a positive force. It contributes to dynamic equilibrium in ecosystems. This was also already known in the past by indigenous communities. There was this practice of cultural burning, where they were using fire to achieve certain benefits, specifically those benefits listed there. When you create small fires here and there in the forest, properly targeted with the right intensity and the right frequency, you help nutrients to return to the soil, ashes. You encourage the growth of desirable wild plants because you suppress more aggressive plants and even invasive plants if there were any. You create high temperature, and high temperature is sometimes needed for the seedlings of certain plants to blossom, for example, oak trees. So through using cultural fires, you create the conditions for new plants to grow, especially the ones that grow to stay longer in the ecosystem. You remove forest underbrush to eliminate pests, rather than reactively try to address pests once they develop. And for their own sake, if you have more grass, then you attract bison herds that you can go hunt to get meat that you need to sustain your community. So all these benefits were achieved through thinking carefully about the frequency that you need to pursue if you want to work synergistically with nature, polyrhythmicity. This is an example of how polyrhythmicity is actually approached in agriculture, and this is a contrast example with the hyper-specialized beef production that I mentioned before. This is Polyphase, FAPESP, regenerative agricultural setup in the States, and this is that process flow diagram describes how they manage their operations. Instead of having just cattle and have intensified cattle in a small space, they have grazing cows in a field that rotate on different patches of land. When the cows go around, they graze the grass and they shorten the grass so that chickens can come by after them, pick apart the manure, and enjoy the new small grass with the nutrients that come from the cows. And that has a synergistic effect because the manure is purified from larvae, and therefore there are no diseases developing because the larvae feed the chickens. The chickens, in picking the manure, they also break down the manure and facilitate nutrients to go back in the soil. Not just that, you have two revenue streams, not just one. You don't only have beef, but you have eggs and chickens. The proportions, not just the rhythms of how many cows and when the cows should go by and when the chickens should come by was synchronized, but also the proportions were important. The number of cows is such that they can keep some hay for the winter. So they keep some hay from the summer into the winter. In the winter, when the cows are not in the pasture, you mix the manure with the hay, and pigs love to roll into it. And they do a natural aeration process, that is a process that transforms hay and manure into highly nutritious compost, which then goes back in catalyzing grass growth in spring. So once again, when you think about rhythms now, you have addressed the problems of biodiversity loss through reconciling the rhythms of your operations with the rhythms that are needed on Earth. I've been told that I'm out of time. I only have a couple of slides. The last principle I wanted to introduce was reciprocity, this idea that there are more synergies than those that we can think and exploit. I'm going to give you a simple one. In retailing, there was a general tendency of squeeze labor budgets because you wanted to focus on efficiency. And so you wanted to reduce your labor budgets. Mercadona, for over 30 years, went in the opposite direction. They gave above average labor budgets, so attracting better workforce all the time. What happened at a time where we didn't have AI and we couldn't track the mix of products that we were selling and how much of that mix was actually matching the request from consumers, you had these highly motivated workers that would feel out what the consumers wanted and feed that information back to procurement to adjust their procurement patterns and show on the shelf the products that were most wanted by the consumers of Mercadona. That resulted in higher efficiency, not through specialization, but through better integration of the labor force with the customer base. And this type of reciprocity in place, so synergies, can be found in all the examples that I illustrated to you. Think about Jarkki Sarki, which was that company of community of fishers in Finland, that by adjusting and synchronizing with the natural environment, they created reciprocity for themselves, economic returns, ecological returns for the lakes, and social returns for the local community that would drink fresh water, all in one business model. So this idea of reciprocity and synergies at play. I'm going to skim through a few more things. This is the summary. We have three core principles that have been guiding how we approach supply chain management and business more in general. And in this article, we propose three principles that antagonize with that approach to show that working in harmony with nature is not just possible, but is also viable. And my call to action is the last bullet point here. Examples that embody these principles already exist. However, they are not the average, and most of our research focuses on average behaviors. We should start focusing on viable outliers that have been able to thrive even in a system, business system, that provides incentive that goes against their approach. Don't make it easy on them to pursue those principles that I mentioned. And yet they have been doing it, they have been doing successfully, and they have been viable. So here are just some examples. gas, Inversa, Karun, Kalmura Natural Worlds, Allbirds, Urban Jacks. Those are just the one that I know. Which one do you know? And how do they work? And how their model can be then replicated in other areas. That's what I want, the message and the call to action that I want to leave you with. Thank you. Oops. I have another 70 slides after that. Any question? I know I abused the time that was given to me, but I would be happy to take a couple
We have really time constraints, so suggest 2 questions perhaps, and then yeah.
So then 1 man and 1 woman.
Hello, thanks for presentation. I will ask, you mentioned about some data about US economy and social disruption, like murdering. So I have allergy. So the income inequality is increased and the social welfare is not enough for the all population. After the pandemic, with the technological revolution, we see some countries' economy increased, but just on the paper. For example, in the Europe, we divide the population according to their economic value, just low, middle, and high. Nowadays, there is no middle class. They shift the low income. So for the young generation, it is important to their country's economy growth because they can thinking about own their home or some basic and main needs. So what is your advice for the young generation? Because I think for the young people, there is no hope we will think like this because the rich get rich and the poor one gets poor much more. So what is your advice? Thanks.
Well, a couple of things. There are papers in Nature that actually show that the level of happiness and well-being in communities, in rural communities in some parts of South Africa and the Philippines that are not as advanced as we claim some of our economies are, their level of happiness is actually equal, if not higher, than the level of happiness of the top social class in developed countries, which shows that economic accumulation is not really even conducive of well-being and happiness. Those concepts are just context specific. So I want to say that because it is important that we start to break apart the correlation between economic wealth and happiness. They are not correlated, right? Not to a point. So let's pursue happiness and make sure that we adjust our economics according to it, reverse the means and the ends. The other one, I think you are perfectly right. According to this anatomy, even if many of us don't want to see it, economic inequality, if addressed, would solve some of the problems that we are experiencing because you would expose those that have inappropriate behaviors to the consequences of that behavior. So I believe that that's a reflection that we need to nurture as a global community. At the individual level, you can decouple your income level with your consumption patterns. I can explain more about it, but everything I'm dressing is about 15 to 20 years old, and I'm not kidding. So these shoes have been remanufactured 3 times by a local shop that I happen to rely upon. Small changes, but be the change that you want to see in society.
Well, really great presentation. You explain things very good that
Thank you.
are usually in very hard way in paper, so that's impressive. Well, my question is that, for example, in Chile, we have such a good index right now, but people don't really feel that we are like improving or that our country is heading into a more developed way. So my question to you is, do you propose other ways of measuring like a more largest developed countries or a different way of scaling economics, because the way that they do it right now, you at the end of the month you will still feel that you don't have much to offer back to society.
I wanted to go back to the slide where I showed a study in 2013, this one, where this study is based on 19 countries that participated to this experiment all over the globe. And they started to track what is called a genuine progress indicator, GPI, as an alternative measure of GDP. And when they realized that they couldn't show any growth, they killed their participation in those projects. And they started to focus again on GDP, which is a measure that they know how to influence, and therefore creates a sense of safety in how they can address the population. So there are metrics. There is always innovation in how we can measure things. But realistically, some of the metrics we have are good enough. It is the political capital that is required to embrace those metrics that is lacking. And my personal reflection is that that political capital is lacking because information is not used as it should. So this school and other educational initiatives around the world need to be empowered so that more people get a sense of what the anatomy of the crisis really is, what are the principles that sustain it. And when new taxes or new measures are proposed, they understand how those measures work in building GPI rather than GDP, and how they will now or shortly in the future benefit from those changes. Ignorance is the big elephant in the room, I believe. And not just among lower classes, even elite professors.
Okay, thank you so much, Yuri. Very
Thank you again.
provocative, very, very interesting. I think those three principles are key, so we'll keep discussing them. And even when I discuss the Natura case next week, I will go back to those principles to apply them. So thank you so much.